I hope you all had the chance to get a cup of tea and coffee. It's great that you've all been able to stay with us all day at this fantastic event, and thank you very much to everybody who's still online as well. I'm not sure how many have made it through to 3:30, but we come to our final session today. My name's Tom Burston. I work for the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. And this session is all about the politics of the food and farming transition. Please keep your questions coming through this session, and we'll have time halfway through to direct some of them to our panel. And I'm delighted to be joined by Lord Currie of Kirkharle, Baroness Young of Old Scone, Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle, and the Right Honourable the Lord Deben. Just to set the scene in the context of what we're going to discuss in this session, I think today has been a really interesting exploration of a really complex web of systems and issues that are at play. And today's reminded us of the urgent challenges in front of farming right now, whether they are frozen or unfrozen. How can farming restore nature and decarbonise and feed all of us a healthy diet? And also in the context of a global pandemic and a devastating war now in Ukraine, that have shown up a serious need to build further resilience into our food and farming systems. Stepping back for a second, the last session I think has reminded us that that is a significant role for farmers. And George and Helen and Martin spoke really powerfully about the decisions and choices that are made on farms. But we are putting farmers in the position to decarbonise our world and to recover nature and to feed us all a healthy diet and to build resilience. But we also must remember that farmers need to run their businesses and to diversify and to negotiate natural capital contracts and to continue being the chair of the parish council and the treasurer of the cricket team as well. And also to be a good wife or a good husband in their families. And I think those challenges remind us of the last agricultural revolution, kick-started in the middle of the 20th century, that positioned farming and farmers at the heart of responding to that great global challenge of that day, to feed a very fast-growing global population. But the challenges today are different and in some ways more complex, but the framing reminds us of that central role of farmers and the central role that they have in helping society build something better. It's not just about changing practice on farms, and we'll talk now about the politics that come to play, but agroecology seems to offer a tantalising glimpse of a future where farmers are central to delivering what is arguably our greatest public goods, a foundational food system that is good for people and families and communities and nations and the planet. And Jyoti and others today have reminded us of the centrality of the personal and social ambitions of farmers and their families as well, to keep in view as we undertake any kind of system analysis. So we've heard that farming and land management need a pathway that unite farming, nature, land, climate, people, energy. But big questions have been raised about the sustainability of existing food systems. Vulnerabilities highlighted by high energy and fertilizer prices, leading to food insecurity and energy insecurity and nutrition insecurity, which is felt at the household level and which must focus minds of our decision makers and our policy makers. There are tensions as we try to negotiate a balanced pathway, and some of them have been surfaced today. The issue is complex. Dietary shifts inextricably linked to changes in supply. Natural capital markets may or may not have increasing influence on land use decisions. Technology and solutions and what governance is required to navigate them. And how governments grapple with how much of a strategic priority land management actually is. And another report out this week, the latest in a long line, reminding us of the wider rural economy and the big structural issues at play there. We've heard policy alone is not enough. And again, as Gareth said in the last session, this is not about looking to politicians to say, come on, fix the problems, but what politics are at play. We've heard about targets in place that have clear and explicit implications on land use. Legislation in the Environment Act to reverse the loss of biodiversity, and a commitment to net zero in the carbon budget. We've heard strong commitments from the Secretary of State for elms and other parts of the agricultural transition plan to support agroecological commitments. But how do political frameworks join up different issues, and what kind of governance is required? How does public policy pull together with markets and the power of markets that are new to farming as well? So with me to give some perspective on the role of Parliament and policy are four highly respected members of the House of Lords who collectively have a lot of years' experience holding these questions. So there's an opportunity for you all to give some first thoughts, and then we'll start fielding questions. Lord Curry, you've been here the longest today. So I'm going to come to you first. Not because you're my neighbour in Northumberland, but perhaps you can introduce a few of your own thoughts, and we'll go from there.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. I thought you were suggesting I was the oldest on the panel. You're probably right. I probably am the oldest on the panel. And this is an interesting model to have a covey of peers and the final session of a conference. And whilst we meet on the floor of the House, we don't always agree on every policy issue, so it'll be interesting to see, without having conferred, how my colleagues contribute to this important debate this afternoon. When I listened to the previous session and heard these enthusiastic young farmers, and I'm including you in that, Helen, enthusing about the changes they're envisaging, how they're driving through these agroecology principles on their farms, it just reminded me why I retired 3 years ago from my farm. It was a wise decision, and I took the decision because I felt we were moving into a world where we need young, enthusiastic farmers to grapple with the challenges that we now face. And I'd been preaching to audiences for as long as I can remember that farmers shouldn't aspire to die with their wellies on, which in many cases they do. So retiring because of this massive change in policy was a conscious decision, and I'm pleased we took that decision. Let me just say that I supported the policy changes. The principle of moving from direct support to support for public goods where there's evidence of market failure makes very logical sense. So public support for public goods where the market has failed to deliver whatever those goods are you're hoping to achieve those outcomes is a sensible policy approach. But that requires very careful definition of what those public goods are and what their value is. And that's where it begins to get a little bit complicated and difficult. And what we're facing now, I think, within agriculture is a virtually impossible time frame for farmers to adjust to the scale of the change that's being envisaged. So the transition is a challenge. There is quite a lot of confusion at this moment in time. Whatever Secretary of State might say, farmers are quite confused about what the policy is and how it's going to play out and work in practice. There's a whole load of new terminology that farmers are going to have to understand, and we've been addressing a lot of that today at your conference. And the outcomes are much more complicated and challenging than they used to be. So I grew up in the world where producing food was the only outcome that was actually important. We were incentivized to do it, and we did it very successfully. Now we expect farmers to restore habitats, to produce food, to deliver net zero, to provide amenities and access, and all of those things need to be incentivized appropriately, either by the market or by public intervention, to ensure that we have a balance in the delivery of those outcomes, because we need them all. And at a time when commodity prices are so unpredictable, trying to determine what the value of the various public goods are, almost in balance with the very high inflation we're seeing in input costs and in commodities generally, is a really, really tricky balance. So how are we going to value these public goods? And how light on our feet can we be as a government to ensure that we pitch the value of these public goods at a certain level which is going to incentivize farmers to deliver them? And by the way, have the Treasury bought into this? Because that's an absolutely fundamental question. To retain the 3 billion direct support or whatever it was within the Treasury budget is going to be a challenge against all the pressure there is on public expenditure. If we truly value the market for public goods in Britain, I suspect is far greater than 3 billion. So how are we going to finance the delivery of these critical public goods with the Treasury is going to be watching their purse strings very, very carefully indeed? So the question I asked myself is, as a farmer in Northumberland, Tom, how is the average livestock farmer in Northumberland going to be able to adjust to the world we're moving into? What are the public benefits those farms deliver day after day on their farms? Many of them can be improved, of course. They can deliver a lot more. But how are they going to be valued, and what are the benefits going to be quantified at in order for those farmers to have a reasonable chance of surviving and adjusting to the pace of change that's going to be required and to sustain their businesses? Incidentally, the whole area of natural capital is, I think, a fascinating study. I have to say, as I look around the landscape that I live in, most of the boundary trees on our fields are ash. The majority are ash. And the majority are slowly dying through ash dieback. So if you're doing an audit of natural capital today on our landscape in Northumberland, I have to say you have to discount the fact these ash trees are not going to be delivering carbon sequestration for very much longer. So quantifying the value of natural capital and how that's reflected in a farm business that can't market that right now, and the market is very immature at this point in time, and high risk, I think, for many farmers, particularly tenant farmers who may not have an agreement with their landlord to approach that, and the length of time required within a tenancy to benefit from that over time is one of the major challenges we face right now. So finally, from me, again, Helen will know this from our days in the Meat and Livestock Commission. When we keep talking about reducing meat and dairy, as we had in the previous conference, I get very irritated, I have to say. Because our challenge is to reduce methane. It's not to reduce meat and dairy per se. We need to reduce methane. It might mean reducing meat and dairy, but the challenge is, how can we reduce our methane? And let's make sure we properly understand the science around methane before we get hung up on a message which is becoming entirely ingrained within our language, that the only way to solve, one of the crucial ways to solve climate change is to reduce meat and dairy. Our livestock systems in the main, in Britain, are among the most sustainable in the world. And we need to retain many of those grazing livestock in order to retain the habitats, the landscape, the features, the appeal of the landscape of the United Kingdom. So yes, we have to reduce methane, but let's explore what technologies we can use to do that without necessarily assuming that means a significant reduction in consumption and therefore in the number of animals of meat and dairy. One final thing, and Natalie will pick this up. I was interested to hear, obviously I wasn't here to hear the Minister, that he made a big play on how important soil is to DEFRA. If it hadn't been for Natalie and myself and others pursuing this within the Environment Bill, we would not have had the focus on soil within government. And it's so crucial, and we need to understand it much more than we do now. For example, I mean, until December, I chaired an organisation that had the responsibility for analysing 70% of our soils. Our understanding of carbon sequestration and the carbon content of our soils is at a very early, immature level, but it varies from field to field significantly, from areas within fields. So if we want to maximise the carbon sequestration of our soil, we have to do much more analysis, and we really have to focus on our farming systems in order to get the maximum value out of that. I think I've spoken too long, Tom.
Thank you, Lord Curry. Your comments, I think, on soil and the example there that you gave at the end is a good sort of reason why we have a two-house system in our political structures in London, and how those people and individuals can use their experience to actually work on political frameworks and move the dial, if you like. I think your comments about the interplay between the market and policy as well speaks to what we heard from Professor Benton this morning about political choices and the role of the market. But a quick follow-up question, if I may, Lord Curry, given the emergence and pace of development of natural capital markets that you referred to, and at least the promise or the perception of a lot of new private money entering the system, is public policy in danger of becoming irrelevant?
No, it's not, because I think we need public policy and public intervention in order to restore our biodiversity, our habitats, and the planting of trees, so that the value of our natural capital becomes much more marketable in the future. So this, in my view, this is a staged approach in many instances. Of course, we could value our natural capital now, but if this is work in progress, my personal view is that we need the public intervention in order to really provide us with the opportunities to maximise our income through the commercial world.
Thank you. Baroness Bennett, can I invite you to come in on the back of Lord Curry's comments and give your own thoughts about the role of Parliament and policy in this transition?
Well, thank you very much, and it's lovely to follow Lord Curry and to thank everyone on this panel. That soil fight was quite a fight, and it was a learning curve for me very much. And we did make some real progress, but as always, one of the political lessons is you never get as far as you want to get, but you make some progress. And that's the nature of politics, is you have to make a big claim and drag everything as far as you possibly can in the right direction without necessarily expecting to win. I wanted to pick up on the point that Lord Curry said about the importance of the Treasury. And also, unfortunately, I wasn't able to listen to George Eustace this morning, but people have been saying to me that he was on the sparing versus sharing debate, was coming down broadly on the right sort of side and was talking about the need to look after all of our land, etc. I'm afraid I'm going to offer a quote from Hansard that shows you where perhaps I might say the most important parts of government are. And this is from Baroness Penn, Jojo Penn, who I have a great deal of respect for, but she is very much, I think you would say, a Treasury woman. And she was answering questions on the Dasgupta report, which was, of course, commissioned by the Treasury. But she wasn't exactly on her comfortable ground, because there was people like Rosie Boycott were asking her questions about the biology and the food, not about the numbers. And I thought that was really interesting, what was obviously a prepared answer by the department from the Treasury, which starts off well. Food security and biodiversity and the preservation of our land do not have to be in tension with each other. Sounds good. The aim of our environmental land management scheme is to promote both goals by making farming and agriculture more productive and sustainable on some land, while using land that may be less productive to achieve our biodiversity goals. It's an absolutely pure story of sparing some of the land and trashing the rest. And that's entirely what is coming out of Treasury. And that's the political challenge that we face, because if you look at the power of government departments, I think everyone in this room knows where the power actually lies. We're asked to talk about some of the political challenges, and I thought I would begin with an effort from the previous panel. The challenge was to define agroecology, and I think the Soil Association picked up and tweeted this when I used this once. My definition is not a scientific technical one, but it means for me working with nature instead of coshing it into submission. And that's my definition of agroecology. And I'm a great fan of I can be a real geek. You know, I had lots of fun when we were talking about soils. I'm proud of the fact that I was the first person to ever get the word tardigrade into Hansard. That was in my maiden speech. I did it properly just for fun. But I listened to the Big Biology podcast, which, if you want to get really geeky, is a really interesting deconstruction of essentially all of the science and all of the way we've approached nature and the land and our own health over the last few decades. And there was a recent one on those talking about why we should not regard animals and plants as machines. And another way of looking at the agroecological approach is understanding that we are not having a system where you can just take one element, one cog, change the size of the cog, and everything else just keeps running the same. And yet we're very much struck in that mindset. And I was recently, another one of those windmills I was tilting at was the recent government regulations on genetically modified organisms. And I wasn't getting a lot of support in the House. But I must admit, and I'm not being rude here, I'm really not, but I was sitting there thinking about a very famous scientific maxim, which is that science proceeds one funeral at a time, which is that ideas about science, changes in theories, don't happen because people change their mind. It happens because new people come along with different ideas that sweep aside the old ideas, but it doesn't mean the people who held those old ideas change their mind. And that is a practical problem about the reality. The House of Lords does many brilliant things and there's many brilliant people there. But if you formed your views about agriculture and, you know, there were people in this debate saying, well, I was agriculture minister 35 years ago. I'm not ageist. It's perfectly possible to keep up. I wouldn't claim to be young myself. But nonetheless, if you're not keeping up, one of the reasons why I'm totally fascinated with soils is my first degree was agricultural science in Australia, if you haven't picked up the accent, 35 years ago. And I was taught soil science as a chemistry subject. And so there's a huge job of education that needs to be done to Parliament. And the thing is, of course, this is not just in the kind of topics we're talking about today. We have very few people in Parliament with a scientific background. And that is a huge problem. Many years ago, I testified to the Commons Science and Technology Committee, and there were 11 members, and one of them had a scientific background. And it's not much better now. So there's a real job for many of the people in this room to educate Parliament, to bring people along in terms of time and in terms of their understanding of the biology and the way the world works. And we've also really got to tackle the idea in Parliament of what innovation is. Because we are still, you hear the government almost invariably, and I will give one call out to George Freeman, who I did actually ask him a question about innovation, and he actually talked about human microbiome. I nearly fell over with shock. But there needs to be an understanding, a different kind of understanding of what innovation is. And efficiency. The previous panel, someone was talking about those big giant expanses of fields and how we need to see smaller fields. How incredibly inefficient it is to have that huge expanse of field that's just saying to every pest and disease in creation, hey, come here, there's a giant feast here, come here. But there's something else too. We've got to take on the idea of tidiness. I want a war on tidiness.
Yeah.
People like...
Enemy of civilization, tidiness.
So I'm aware I'm probably running out of time, but all of these are ideas that have the barest foothold in Parliament. And that's why I'm addressing this. So we've really got to... There's a job, enormous job of education to be done in Parliament. And, you know, where you really have to work... Now, here's a challenge for you. It's not DEFRA, it's Treasury. Thank you.
Thank you, Baroness Bennett. Really interesting comments about advice and knowledge, and it echoes what we've heard today already from some of our farmers in the room about the need for knowledge intensification into farming as well, and the need to hold that open as a framework to support the change that's needed. If I may, I'll move on to Lord Deben, because I know you have a train or a car to catch, and you were, of course, Minister of Agriculture 35 years ago. So I wonder if you might bring some of your long experience to bear in this conversation.
I thought it was a rather pointed remark, really. It seemed to be rather...
It wasn't you I was thinking of, I promise.
It started with ageism and it's moved on, you know. I mean, it's very... Look, I think we are waking up from a delusion which we have lived in the Western world since the fall of the Berlin Wall. When the wall came down, we started to believe in three absolutely untruths. The first one was that we'd never have another war in Europe. The second was that we didn't have to think about fuel security. And the third one was that we didn't have to think about food security. And I remember when I was Minister of Agriculture being interviewed by the cleverest man in Europe, Peter Jay. And he said, of course, I don't know why we have a Minister of Agriculture, because we don't need to grow any of our own food, because we can always get it from somewhere else. The ignorance which has lain behind politics for so long. Now, I declare an interest. I am a small farmer. I'm a small organic farmer. I'm doing the opposite of Lord Curry, because we have increased our small farm from a very small farm to a slightly larger farm. And we are just completing our conversion of that bit that we have taken over into being organic. And I am committed to the principles of starting with the soil, because I was converted to that by the great Lady Balfour, whose really only comment was that we should care about the soil. And it seems to me that that is absolutely central and utterly right. The problem with the politics of Britain is that it is entirely urban-based. I'd prefer to have an out-of-date agriculture minister than somebody who wouldn't know the difference between a cow and a sheep if you asked. I always remember when being on one side in the hunting debate that one of the people who was demanding that we should stop hunting couldn't tell the difference between a rabbit and a hare. Now, it doesn't matter which side of the debate you're on, but if you can't tell the difference between a rabbit and a hare, you shouldn't be in the argument. And the same is true about so much about the countryside. It just is so difficult to talk about any of these things and feel that you're talking to people who have some grasp of this. This is why Jeremy Clarkson has become, yet again, one of my heroes. I hate motor cars, so that wasn't very good. But the way in which he manages to show people just how difficult it is to be a farmer and just how different it is to be a farmer. Nobody else has to deal at the same time with no rain, followed by floods, followed by avian flu. You don't do that if you're making widgets. You don't do that if you're advising people on their legal rights. You don't do that if you're in Parliament. This is a totally different operation. And therefore, when people talk about agriculture as if it is just like anything else, it shows they don't understand it. And so I just want to put 4 very simple things into your mind. The first is the politics of agriculture demand that if we ask of British farmers the kind of mixed responsibilities which we've just spoken, then they must not be undermined by subsidised food coming in from elsewhere. Our trade policy has got to be quite clear. if you don't meet the standards of fighting climate change, which we do, Australia, we don't bring your food in here without a price, which pays the difference. And the second thing that we have to say is this. No one could be more enthusiastic than I am about moving towards a different way of paying. But I just want people to remember that farmers in this country have depended upon a production support, not just during the period of the Common Agricultural Policy. We had practically the same policy before, it was differently organised, but deficiency payments was exactly the same thing in the sense of what it sought to do. And it, brilliantly followed by the great Tom Williamson in the Labour government, followed what actually had been done by the coalition government during the war for the reasons that our chairman pointed out, to get the amount of food that we needed to get through the war when we couldn't import from anyone. So there isn't a farmer alive that has ever worked in a system which wasn't a production-based system. And yet the government seems to think that it's terribly easy to move from one to the other, and doesn't seem to think that you've got to be detailed in what you say you're going to do. I am tired of government ministers talking as if everybody knows what to do. It's no good. People deciding now what they have to plant for a year's time have absolutely no idea what the government is really offering. And what's more, have no idea about what, if they make some choices, it excludes other choices later on. And so for me, the second really important thing about agricultural policy is that government have really got to recognise that agriculture is a continuous but long-term decision-making process. And you have to make it possible for people to work their way through that by being precise, and also being precise about what won't happen, as well as precise about what will happen. Doesn't help that I sometimes wonder whether there's anybody in the department called DEFRA that actually knows how to make those. It's not because they're stopping telling us, it's because they don't know what to tell us, which is why we're in this particular mess. And the third thing that I hope we will take away is this, that climate change is best defined in the words of the Pope in his encyclical Laudato Si, when he says that climate change is the symptom of what we've done to the world. And if you think of it in that way, then you do understand why biodiversity, why soil health, why modern slavery, why the way in which we feed ourselves stuff that we shouldn't, why all that actually links together. Climate change is the earth crying out that it's diseased and it needs actually to be healed. And that's why when I talk about net zero, I'm very keen that people should remember that it's not just the zero bit, it's not just the bringing down of the emissions, it's the net bit, which is to give back to the earth the ability it had to heal itself. Because after all, we always have emissions. All of us are emitting like mad. The poor old cows have got a bad name for it, but it's us as well. We're all emitting. And unless you want to be sort of extreme green who prefer the world without any people, unless you take that view, then the fact is we all have to recognise that it's the balance that we've got wrong, the balance of nature. That's why I came back to my second female heroine, which is in fact, of course, Rachel Carson. The balance of nature is what we really have to recover. And that's what net zero is about. It is about recovering that balance. And therefore the farming community and land use, a great operation that Baroness Young has done to try to get people to have an actual land strategy, is because only using the land, and as a matter of fact the sea as well, in a way which it can bring back the health of the planet, will we actually win this? And the last thing I just want to say is, we really must not allow these things to become the plaything of our particular interest. I'm very pleased that the Soil Association is talking about regenerative farming. It's not saying you've got to do what we want. What it's saying is this is why we want what we want and we want you to join in. I am fed up with people who use these issues for their own purpose. I'm happy for you to be a vegan, but don't tell me that being a vegan is going to solve the problem, because we need animals. None of us can do this job without animals, and of course we ought to eat less meat and eat better meat. We should eat 20% less meat, and we should eat British produced meat because it's got the lowest carbon footprint in the world, and we should eat less of it because it would be better for us. What I'm asking for is much less than the health loonies will. I mean, if you want to listen to the people who really want to do you down, it's the people who want to make you live forever but be more miserable most of it. The fact is that what we have to do is not to allow other people to use these really important things for what is actually their own agenda. Our agenda is to return the health of our planet so it can heal itself and reduce the demands we make on it so it has the power to heal itself.
Thank you, Lord Deben. Thank you for reminding us of the need for balance in our systems. And I know you and the team at the Committee for Climate Change are looking at how to integrate biodiversity questions into the carbon question as well. And we look forward to seeing how that continues. I just want to pick up on one of the points you made about the cross-departmental, if I may, or the cross-issue sort of context that food sits in. My question to you is, how do we create the political willingness to elevate food as a nationally strategic issue in such a way that Parliament and policy can actually give it the due concern that it needs? Is it time for a Committee on Climate Change equivalent for food?
Well, I don't know about that last, but I do know that I was cheered when the excellent Minister in the House of Lords, Lord Bennett, said unequivocally yesterday that he saw food production as the major public good that farmers produce. Now, we've never heard that before, and his boss may not have heard it, and I certainly don't think that the Prime Minister has yet heard it, but it does seem to me to be obvious, and that's where you start. Secondly, the food industry is our largest industry, and there are food producers in every constituency in Britain except Westminster. And it might be worth reminding members of Parliament how important the food industry is. And it's composed of all sorts of small businesses, and increasingly so as we try to eat locally and as more and more people recover local products in the way which they are doing. So my own view is that the real problem is that nobody takes the food industry seriously because it is split between, in a sense, it's in the pocket of DEFRA, but it's really a business like others. And we have somehow or other to overcome that problem. And that's why I helped very much to form the Food and Agriculture Sector Council, why I think it's really important, why farmers and food producers and distributors ought to work together. And part of the problem is that we haven't done that. And that's what we have to do, and we have to have a common way of talking to government. And government has got to get much better at breaking the silos between BEIS and DEFRA and the Department of Health, and start thinking really much more seriously about all those things together.
Thank you very much. And finally, certainly but not least, Baroness Young, there's an invitation there to talk to us about some of the work that you're involved in at the moment, but perhaps you can give us your thoughts as well.
It's really hard to follow at this point after such eminent and aged contributors. The exception of Baroness Bennett.
I said I was old.
And I must admit, I am looking forward to the Pope's next outing when he gives us a definition of agroecology. So perhaps John could put a word in for that. I am fixated at the moment with something that is a bit of a car crash, and that is, if you look at the demands for land, everybody wants land. We need it for carbon sequestration, we need it for food production, we need it for trees, we need it for timber, we need it for flood risk management, we need it for built development, we need it for health and mental health and access and recreation. Everything that we've been talking about in the last day needs land, and there is no mechanism whatsoever for allowing competing decisions about priorities for land use to happen, either at a national level or a regional level or a local level. And the planning system is not that process, because it's uniquely, I mean, it's called the town and country planning system, but the country bit never gets a look in. And so after about, I don't know how many years of being really boring about it, we finally got a land use select committee established in the House of Lords this year. It's going to report in November. And we've been having some fascinating evidence sessions. And can I say that I think the land sparing versus land sharing debate is over. It's over. Henry Dimbleby has recanted. He doesn't believe it anymore. So that's a good sign. Every single person we've had giving us evidence so far has said without any doubt that it's got to be multifunctional land use, where land works for its living on several successive fronts and delivers multiple objectives. So I think if the Treasury, and I share a lot of your views about Baroness Penn, who I think is brilliant. Unfortunately, she's the wrong bloody party, but never mind. You know, I think the Treasury is going to just get such a wall of noise coming at them if they attempt to pull that one off, that we can beat that no problem at all. So it's probably too early for me to preempt what the committee will say, but I will try.
I will report back.
The first is that we probably do need some sort of framework of principles or something at national level that actually tries to enunciate a multifunctional vision of land use and some principles that could be useful at lower levels for dealing with competing priorities. And it may well be that we should look at some of the mechanisms that have been used elsewhere. You know, we've got mechanisms in Wales, we've got mechanisms in Scotland with the Land Use Commission and the Future Generations Act in Wales, all of that stuff. But we also need to look at the tools that can be used to handle competing priorities. And data and mapping is going to be really important. You know, the insights from overlaying good data-driven maps is going to be really important. And getting people at every level in the system comfortable with engaging with that sort of data and finding it helpful rather than bamboozling is going to be really important. But we shouldn't also forget some of the old-fashioned tools and instruments that we've had. You know, scenario painting at local level is happening with a lot of the local nature recovery strategy type initiatives. But of course they are what they say on the tin, local nature recovery strategies. And what we need is local land use modulation, management. And I'm not talking about being Stalinist, though everyone who knows me knows that I, you know, given half a chance, would be Stalinist. But I recognise that I'm not going to get away with that. But I do think that we need to get some scenarios going at national and local level. We need to start model building. We need to start giving people excitement about the sorts of multi-purpose land use that can actually deliver all the benefits that we need delivered for the public good, including food production. And they've got to be backed up then by incentives, by regulation, by taxation, all the traditional levers and instruments. So there's a big bit of work for us to do to describe how we move forward in all of this. And above all, it's got to recognise one simple little fact, and that is none of us are going to be making global decisions at a national level about land use. Decisions about competing land uses are going to be made by the 140,000 plus substantial landowners and land managers in this country. They're the folk who are going to make the decisions. So whatever we do, it's got to be with them. They've got to be enthused and committed. And I must admit, I don't know if Farmer George is still here. Are you still here, George? Good boy. We had a round table in front of the committee a few weeks ago, and I was just dreading it. I was really dreading it because, you know, farming round tables, and it had a slight element, I'm being rotten to my fellow peers, it had a slight element of everybody on the committee wanting their mate to come along and give us evidence. Were you there at that point?
No, I couldn't attend that. All my mates were there, but I wasn't.
It was brilliant. You know, farmers of every hue were saying such incredibly visionary and exciting things about the future. And I came away and had a double gin on the back of it. It was brilliant. So land use has got to be a big issue. And at the moment, the government is just totally blind to it. The second point I want to make is that the food and health thing, and we've said a lot about it already, but you know, over the last 2 years, our kids have got even fatter. And I don't know about you, but I've got a gut complaint, and I've got to be quite careful about what I eat. And you just hit this wall of obesogenic food wherever you go. And we can't carry on like that. We really cannot carry on like that. So healthy food is not just about what farmers grow and what processors make. It's about how we influence people to understand the damage that they're doing to our future through our kids. And all of those approaches to food have got to be able to come together and have some sort of dialogue. And, you know, government doesn't care a bugger about obesity in kids. I mean, it says it does. And if it looks at the real cost of obesity in kids in terms of pressures on the NHS, poverty, inequalities, the sorts of things that we saw during COVID when poor fat families were the ones who got it worst, I hate to say. You know, all of that has got to be gripped by government. Otherwise, these broader problems are going to come back and bite them. You know, the NHS is going to get overwhelmed by people with diabetes. We are going to see the working age population not able to work. All of those things have got to be gripped. And at the moment, they don't think that there are any votes in food and that there are votes lost, in fact, by trying to tell people what they should and shouldn't eat. But there are ways around that, and we've got to get the political momentum behind it. The third thing I want to say is, would somebody kindly tell government that government has a series of departments because you've got to chunk it up somehow. But, you know, this is a system-wide, the whole agriculture and food and public goods from land and climate and biodiversity and all of that is a big system. And we've got to take a big system approach to it. And remarkably few policymakers, both civil servants and particularly ministers, but civil servants as well, understand how you get things to happen in these big systems. When I was a girl, not yesterday, we used to teach civil servants how to do that. I don't think we seem to do that anymore. It's all very odd. Perhaps it's the current government's commitment to small government that makes it difficult to do. Stalin would have had the answers, I tell you. And I just want to finish with one. I wasn't here when George was here this morning. Little homily. Everybody else has been kicking government, so why can't I? You know, here we are facing the biggest changes in agriculture and food production for 50, 60 years, the hugest push on climate and the biggest effort to hit the crisis of biodiversity decline. And what's George Eustice doing? He's destabilising all of the expert agencies and arm's length bodies who are actually grappling with these problems at the moment. by the work that is inevitably going to come out that will talk about restructuring Natural England, the Environment Agency, the Rural Payments Agency, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, the Forestry Commission, Forest Enterprise, whatever. Nice one, George, nice one. You know, the things that you're going to be dependent on, which is all these expert bodies out there grappling with these issues, and you kick them in the balls in the short term. Very nice one, George.
Thank you, Baroness Young. Due to my horrendous chairing, we've actually got no time for questions, so we're left with that image to take away from this session. But many thanks to you all for joining us today and giving us an insight on the work of primarily the House of Lords, but also how our parliamentary system works to hold government to account, both formally and informally as well. And thanks to Lord Deben in his absence, who's had to leave us. Perhaps we can all show our appreciation for our panel today. I think I'm going to hand over to James for the wonderful task of wrapping